Today's episode with Josh Shapiro launches on Monday, June 2nd, just 2 days before he unveils a special new project. So on Wednesday, June 4th, make sure you visit collectivehorology.com for all the details. Thanks for listening, and now on with the show. This is Open Work, a look inside the watch industry, a podcast from Collective Horology. I'm Gabe Riley, co-founder of Collective.
And I'm Asher Rapkin, co-founder of Collective. Collective Horology is an independent watch retailer based in Southern California. We carry a wide range of independent brands, including Chapek, Gaga Laboratorio, J.N. Shapiro, and more. To learn more about us and check out our available inventory, visit collectivehorology.com.
Asher, your ears must be burning because speaking of J.N. Shapiro, we have none other than Josh Shapiro himself with us today to talk about watchmaking in America. Specifically, what's required to bring watchmaking at scale back to the United States. It's a hot topic these days, particularly with U.S. tariffs, which have been dominating the news. And of course, they're intended, at least in part, to bring manufacturing back to the United States. With that in mind, we thought it would be worth taking a look at what would actually be required to restore the American watch industry.
So, our guest today is Josh Shapiro, an American independent watchmaker. He's based in Los Angeles, and together with a team of watchmakers, engineers, and machinists, Josh has been bringing watchmaking at the highest level back to the United States. In fact, his latest creation, the Resurgence, is currently the only watch to meet the standard of Made in America as defined by the United States Federal Trade Commission. Josh, welcome to Open Work. We're really, really happy to have you.
Pleasure to be here, guys.
Thanks, man. I want to dive in with some history, and it's important for us to ground what we're going to talk about here in what was a critical and I think a significant industry in the United States up until a point. So I'd love for you to just give us a little bit of an idea, paint a picture for us of, at its height, what was the American watch industry like?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. And just first off, real quick, I'd like to thank both of you guys for having me on. You guys are doing a huge part in restoring American watchmaking. We've been working together for a long time, and I think we all have similar dreams and goals, and it's been a lot of fun working with you guys. I'm not even bitter at all that I'm like the 10,000th guest on this podcast.
You're the 41st guest, Josh. 41st.
So American watch industry at its height was probably the early 1900s. At that point, Waltham was at its strongest, and the entire manufacturing process that Waltham had developed had already spread to Elgin, was spreading to Hamilton, and the U.S. was cranking out millions of extremely high-grade pocket watches. These pocket watches were chronometer grade, beautifully decorated, and made in a way that millions could be produced. And it was so influential that it influenced the entire way that things were manufactured in general, influencing companies like Ford.
Josh, I remember when, we first met, this must have been back in 2019. You were still making watches, literally in your garage, which was just cool. And it's amazing to see how far you've come, which I'm sure we'll chat about. But I remember on the bench in your garage were a number of Hamilton pocket watch movements. And I'd never really taken the time, and I suspect a lot of watch collectors haven't really taken the time to kind of look at those kinds of watches and movements. And I remember just being blown away by the level of decoration and finishing, and asking you, like, are these some kind of special watches here or watch movements here? Like, these are incredibly beautiful. One of them was like hand engraved, and I think another was using like some kind of damascening process. And they're just really these wild, beautiful movements. And you're like, not really anything special. No, like Hamilton was kind of the gold standard and was known around the world for their decoration and finishing. And really the American watch industry was sort of the envy of the world at its height. And I guess that may be one of the things the American watch industry was known for. But at its height, what set the American watch industry apart? What made it unique? You mentioned some of the things that other countries copied, but like if you think about today in automotive industry, the Germans are known for performance.
Yeah.
What was the American watch industry kind of known for and the envy of?
Yeah, so we were specifically excellent at time-only watches that were extremely accurate. And at the same time, these watches were also beautifully finished. So, like you take like a Hamilton 923, which I think about 3,000 or 5,000 were made. And today, this would be a $20,000, $30,000 movement. And they were able to mass produce those. And then they had their 923 was the highest grade, and they had their 921, which was nearly as nice. And they made about 50,000 of those. And they had their 917. They made hundreds of thousands of those. And so extremely accurate, extremely high decoration. The areas we never really got into were complications. That was the realm of the Swiss. And then the decline of American watchmaking was wristwatches. That was a huge pivot for those companies to make, from pocket watches to wristwatches, which we can discuss more later. That was the beginning of a decline and sort of Swiss ascendancy.
Can you tell us a little bit about what this era of industrialization looked like? And the reason why I want to go here is eventually we're going to get to what the modern industrialized watch industry looks like abroad, certainly, and what it would take to come here. But in this particular era, when you're talking about, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of pocket watches being manufactured, what did industrialization at that time look like? What was the machinery? What was the workforce like? I mean, who were these people, and what were these factories?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the coolest and biggest contributions that America had during the Industrial Revolution. The watchmaking industry, many industries were making things one at a time, very high on the craftsman side of things, and kind of making things fit and work together, even watches. And what the Americans were incredible at was figuring out automatic procedures that were very repeatable for producing parts. And that would have a huge influence on the rest of the world, car industry. But in watches, for example, there's a part called a balance staff. And you can fit about 100 balance staffs on the face of a penny. It's a tiny, tiny, tiny part. And this week, we were able to make these finally automatically again in this country using really state-of-the-art CNC technology. And in America, all the way back in the 1870s, they were able to make these tiny components automatically again and again, hundreds of thousands of them, without computers, using mechanical cams that were just super precise. And it was they were producing watches at the same level that we're able to produce today on state-of-the-art technology. So the accomplishment was massive. And when the Swiss came and visited in 1876, it was clear that they needed to change from their cottage hand-fitting industry and upgrade their technology to what we were doing, or they were going to get left behind by the U.S.
Speaking of inflection points and turning points, what was it about wristwatches? I mean, you mentioned that was a turning point for American watchmaking. What exactly happened there? How did we go from this kind of dominance and prowess you're describing with pocket watches to trouble with wristwatches? What exactly happened?
Yeah, so I think that had to do with the way U.S. factories were set up versus the Swiss as an industry. The watchmaking industry was one of several industries in the United States. And these massive watch companies, Waltham, Elgin, Hamilton, would do everything in one factory. And they only really had a few different sizes of pocket watches. Most pocket watches were 16 size, pretty large. The other most popular size was 12 size. And that was two sizes of watches that they were super specialists on. And wristwatches, as they became more popular, were in many different sizes, many different case designs, many different dial designs. And so to retool, to reset up, to do all these very different types of watches was really tough for these companies to switch up their tooling and be able to switch over to different watches. Well, the Swiss had basically a country of subcontractors. Every little village would have a different specialist company. And for them, it was much easier. They're much more adroit at just being able to switch components and bring it all together. And part of that was because the whole country was engaged in this trade. It was one of their major industries. Whereas in the United States, it was one of many different things we were involved in.
So let's talk a little bit about when that pivot started to happen. Now, you talked about it in relation to product. So
Yeah.
pocket watch to wristwatch, for example. I'm curious, were there other factors that started to pull the industry away from America into, I mean, certainly there was always a watchmaking, a European watchmaking center, but what were some of the forces that gravitationally pulled the business out of the United States into the places that many people think of as the archetypal watch production, centers, the Swiss, the German, and then obviously down the road, the Japanese?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think if what I'm about to talk about hadn't have happened, I think the US watch companies would have been able to transition and pivot into wristwatches very smoothly and into more complications. But the Swiss were hyper aggressive to other countries involved in watchmaking. They had a very clear plan, and they even formed a cartel within the country where the government and the watchmaking companies got together and made it so any Swiss company selling movements to other countries would be made illegal or barred from doing that. And the Swiss became very protective of their industry and very aggressive towards other industries. So they knocked out the French watchmaking industry, the British watchmaking industry, and then the big prize was the American watchmaking industry.
When you say they knocked out, can you be more explicit there? Like, what does that look like? Because if you have, arguably, I can imagine someone listening to this saying, well, hang on a second. If there is a thriving industry that's full of talented folks and they were making these incredible pocket watches, and sure, there's an engineering challenge in moving that skill from one form factor to another. Surely they're capable of it. Like, what power did the Swiss have over the Americans that allowed them, or the British, or what have you, to knock them out?
A large part of it is the ability to undercut prices, and the other aspect of it was to limit any export from Switzerland of movements, cases, etc.
Were there like Swiss e-Bosch that were being used, for example, in
Correct.
America?
Oh yeah. I mean, Nicholas Bowman Scargill talked about this with Fears. I think maybe with us directly. He hasn't been on the pod yet, but Fears used to get most of their components, even if they were assembled in England, from the Swiss, for instance.
Right.
Got it. So it was more of like squeezing the supply chain and undercutting costs, essentially, as a method for extinguishing the industry.
Correct. And, beforehand, before they formed the cartel, the Swiss were very open to selling components so that other watch companies could build watches in other countries. And then this cartel was formed and became very protective. And this cartel lasted from, I think, the early 30s until the 1960s. There's another element to it too, which is relevant to today. In the late 1920s, early 30s, the US was very eager to export goods to Switzerland. And so the reciprocal trade agreements there meant the Swiss wanted to be able to import watches with very little duties, with very little tariffs. And what that meant for the Swiss was that they could chronically undercut US watchmaking in terms of price. And the quotas for how many watches could be imported were loosened and loosened. So the Swiss could import more and more watches. And we're talking the Depression days. So the US really wanted to sell things to the Swiss. And so okay, that means we've got to import more watches as part of this agreement to make this happen. And the victim of that was the US watchmaking scene. They had a really hard time competing with Swiss pricing. And at this time, the Swiss weren't making super expensive watches. It was a lot of inexpensive watches, which were at a lower quality than the American watches. It wasn't until the 40s and 50s that you really saw the vast majority of Swiss watchmaking sort of step up a notch. There's exceptions, of course, like Patek Philippe, but the majority of watches weren't extremely expensive. And then World War II is a whole nother thing. That's a whole nother deep dive what happened during World War II. But already before the war, you were starting to see that, the U.S. market, used to be completely dominated by U.S. watchmaking. Near 100% of watches made in the U.S. or sorry, that were purchased in the U.S. were sold from U.S. manufacturers. And that number started to dip down considerably, that by the time you're in the 1930s, it's about 50-50. Half the watches sold in the U.S. were made in the U.S. And then World War II was a radical change. During World War II, all the U.S. watchmaking companies were only making watches for the military. And at the same time, the Swiss were somehow exporting millions of watches, even though they were surrounded by the Germans, outside of Switzerland to the United States, exceeding their quotas, selling at a much lower price than Hamilton, Waltham, Elgin were selling their watches. And then, if that wasn't enough, after the war, the Swiss refused to sell the U.S. any machinery to make watches. And the U.S. had worn out all their machinery during the war, creating it. And so all those factors combined, and it was just U.S. watchmaking fell off a cliff at that point. Waltham went out of business. Elgin and Hamilton were in a big decline until both Hamilton and Elgin would be out of business in the 60s.
And that was all before what's known as the quartz crisis. I mean, this stuff had kind of been done and dusted before then. I think that's kind of, I mean, I think I kind of knew that, but I also sort of just associated like the demise of American watchmaking with the quartz crisis. But it sounds like it was in this sort of terminal decline for all these reasons beforehand. And maybe the quartz crisis was like the nail in the coffin.
I mean, it was dead as a doorknob, whatever the expression is.
Yeah, doorknob.
6 feet under. There was, Bulova was a quasi-Swiss, quasi-American company, and they lasted till 1977. And that's the quartz crisis kind of knocked off Bulova. But Bulova was kind of representative of what the Swiss were doing to get around tariffs in general. They'd just start a company in the United States, send in Swiss movements, or they wouldn't have to pay as much tariff on a Swiss movement, then they'd assemble in the US. That was Gruen, Bulova, Buren, Wittnauer. All these companies were sort of like Swiss companies for getting around US tariffs. The Swiss set up a lot of assembly places in like Puerto Rico, US territories that were exempt from certain tariffs, so they could assemble the watches there and then send them to the US mainland. So the tariff discussions we're having now were very much so happening, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s. And the US companies were going to Congress and begging for protective tariffs. Please, please protect our industry. And the U.S. at that point was like business, business, business.
Yeah, you're raising a point that we're going to come back to too, and I think we brought this up on our tariff podcast as well, which is to say the good faith argument for a tariff is to protect an industry that's already entrenched, or one that is facing unfair competitive headwinds, let's say. And that actually sounds like it made a lot of sense in the era that you're talking about, which is obviously different than the modern day era, which, we've spent about 20 minutes here talking about what this industry looked like and the challenges that we're facing it. But essentially we enter basically an American watch desert for decades after this.
Yeah.
What I grew up thinking was like a quote unquote American watch, like a Fossil or whatever, might have been like a company that was based in America, but the watches most assuredly were not manufactured here.
Hong Kong.
Yeah. And, I think there's been these little fits and spurts of people making claims around American watchmaking at scale. Shinola comes to mind in that situation. But enter Josh Shapiro, a dapper, young, highly educated school teacher, loves sports cars, and decides one day he's going to liquidate his watch collection because he wants to become a watchmaker. Now, describe that time. It's about a little bit over 10 years ago, right? 15 years ago, give or take?
Yeah, I guess I started watchmaking as a hobby 14 years ago. Yeah.
So it's 14 years ago. You're looking around as an aspiring watchmaker. What does the American watch industry look like in 2011?
Yeah. I mean, I was very naive. Very naive. I think you have to be to try to do something ambitious because you don't know all the heartache and sorrow and difficulties you're going to face. In 2011, I was really in awe of people like Roger Smith and Roland Murphy that were sort of like Roger Smith had done tremendous work to, his mentor and teacher was George Daniels, and George Daniels really took the big first step, and then Roger Smith was able to create serial production watches, and Roland Murphy did a lot to progress American watchmaking. So I was really in awe of these people and what they had accomplished. And at the same time, I was starting to learn about the American watchmaking scene back in the 19th century and early 20th century, and in awe of that as well.
So you start, and I think there's sort of these various stories out there about you as a watchmaker, and so I want to talk about you for a moment before we broaden this out to the larger industry. You have a copy of George Daniels' Watchmaking. You start working from that, but you also were apprenticed, did you not?
Yeah. So early on, around 2015, when I started really deep diving into guilloche, I started learning and working a lot with David Walter.
And
He's taught me a lot about. David Walter is an incredible watchmaker and clockmaker based in the Santa Barbara area. He was, as in his 20s, he was working for Omega in their complications section. And then he went back home to Australia and started making incredible clocks, highly complicated, multi-$100,000 clocks. And when I met him 10 years ago, he wanted to go back to watchmaking. And, he could make a watch from scratch, but he wanted engine turned dials. And at that point, I was just starting to get good enough to do professional work. So I started working with him making dials, but so much of dial making is machining and watchmaking. So I started learning a lot from him as well to kind of progress my machining skills. And then I started dabbling in things like CNCs and all sorts of other areas, but he taught me so much.
So you take the knowledge that you've gained from David and you start making your own watches. This is around the time that you and I meet, 2018 or so, where you're making the Infinity series, which is, of course, at that point, an American-made, Josh Shapiro made dial. You had some other folks working with you in the workshop on hands, I believe.
Artur was working with me by that point.
So Artur was working with you at that point. I remember that's when we met him. And then you were bringing in these really gorgeous movements from Ehrenwerk Dresden, UWD. Yeah. And we're making, and at certain points, I know you guys did some extra decoration on those movements in certain cases and things like that. But really, a lot of the focus was on the dial of the watch. And then the concept, and I suspect you've been thinking about it for some time because you had mentioned to me that you had this aspiration to make a fully American-made watch. Now, at this point, I want to split the conversation into two paths. I want to talk about what goes into making the Resurgence, because the Resurgence obviously is not only a critical watch for you, but is a very important watch, I would argue, for the modern American watch industry. And I want to think about that in parallel to what you had mentioned earlier about the expertise that was originally germane to America around industrialized watchmaking, because the two are related. The question that we hear the most, or the assertion that we see online the most, is, man, we really should just be building this stuff here. How hard could it be? Sure, we just need to invest in some machinery and the rest, but everyone else seems to have figured it out. Why can't we? So I wonder if you can speak a little bit about what would be involved in the creation of an industrialized watch industry in the modern sense here. And can you tell that story through the lens of what it takes to make the Resurgence? Because I think that's kind of an interesting way to look at it. Not that something at that level would be considered an industrialized watch, but rather, I suspect, a lot of the I've been to your workshop, a lot of the machinery you use, a lot of the talent you have would be the same, I suspect, machinery and talent that would be applicable to mass scale production. Am I making a legitimate assertion?
Yeah.
Cool. So can you talk to us a little bit about it that way?
Sure. I think let me address, I think it'll be easier if I address the industry wide, why we don't just have an American watchmaking industry pop up again, right? We've got the machinery, we've got millions of people that are interested in watches in this country. Why isn't it just popping up? And the answer is very, very simple. It comes down to one word: people. At the height of American watchmaking, we had over 100,000 people, if not more, as professionals in the watchmaking, manufacturing, regulating, decorating, all these industries, 100,000 people. I read a a newsletter from Hamilton in the 1950s, and it was talking about how Joe Smith from the Damascening department is retiring this month. When he started in the department, it only had 20 people, and today it has 80 people, right? And this is in the 1950s. And at the time I read that, I said 80 people just doing Damascening for one company.
For those who don't know, that's the American version of Geneva Stripes, essentially.
Right, exactly. And I thought that is many multiples more people that are involved in manufacturing, period, for watchmaking in the United States. And even in Switzerland, they have a labor shortage. So that is one of the biggest problems with being able to bring back the American watchmaking industry here. Sir, we can make hundreds of thousands of cases, but being able to finish those cases, put them together, put them inside of watches that need to be regulated and timed and all these things, that just takes a lot of people. China has a lot of people that are engaged in that profession. Switzerland has a lot of people engaged in it. And, Germany is close enough to Switzerland that they can work together on that. Germany's industry survived a little bit better. Japan was super dedicated from the late 1800s onward to having their own watchmaking industry and has a huge labor force involved in that. US has very little. We have very few watchmaking schools. Almost all the schools are run by Rolex or Swatch or Richemont and are meant to create service technicians for those brands. And so people is the main issue. The people I have, which is germane to the Resurgence, I've worked extremely hard to find these people, to develop their talent, people I trust, extremely talented, some of the top guys out of the watchmaking programs. I'm friends with a lot of the people at the watchmaking school. So I have a team of 15 people. And I've had to work exceptionally hard to build that team. And we have the largest team of people making mechanical watches in the country at 15, which is tiny. We're considered like a small business.
I think the people thing is worth just zooming in on a little bit more here, because you pointed this out, it's not just people who have gone to watchmaking school, because a lot of the watchmaking programs in the US, you're right, they're training service technician, someone who will sit in the service center in Florida or New Jersey or Dallas or wherever, and they will service watches for the companies. And that's an important skill, and we need those people, and we don't have enough of them. But those folks aren't all that is needed to make a watch. I suspect you have 15 people who work for you, but I also suspect you have probably contracted, freelanced, hired out people who have all sorts of skills, whether that's in engineering and mathematics, machining, people who can just service the machinery you have and keep it running. Design, different craft people. Watchmaking, what's so cool about it is it's a very interdisciplinary field, right?
Right, for sure.
So there's a matter of what you need to have a watch company, watchmaking endeavor, 15 people. There's a whole nother kind of set of talent for what you would need to have a really industrial watchmaking company. So I'm assuming watchmakers are critical. What other kinds of people does one need to have a watchmaking company?
Yeah, so I have 3 engineers on staff. Chris is our mechanical engineer. He does a lot of the CAD work to make sure that the watch movement isn't having any big problems or errors or conflicts in it. I have Will, who's a material science engineer, and he does a lot of the heat treating and hardening, tempering, lacquer coatings, all these different things that are materials related. And then I have another engineer that's just in charge of doing people engineering, how do we put this watch together, sort of advanced project management stuff. And so any manufacturing industry, all these things have to be there. And then we have the machinists who are just focused on how we're going to make all these parts. And then we have the watchmakers that are in charge of decorating and putting it all together. So it's 3 separate departments that have to come together and work together.
So let's get into that. So there's a talent challenge, right? So let's put that in bucket one.
Yeah.
I'm curious, and there's another side of it too, which gets brought up, but I'd like you to tell me if this is true or if it's not as much of an impediment as I would imagine, which is hardware, like the machinery required. So going into your workshop over the last few years, I've seen the amount of CNC machines and various other pretty awesome toys metastasize pretty significantly. And without going into the numbers you've shared with me, like it's a lot of money, man.
Yeah.
And you've invested quite a significant amount of cash into products that aren't just purchased or leased or whatever. You also have all these service contracts associated with them and significant education associated with them, right? They're contrary to popular belief. There is no make watch case button on a CNC machine. Like it is right. I mean, it's a complicated process. So we have this one side of it, which is, all right, so there's no robust pipeline per se for developing proper watchmakers versus technicians. So that's kind of like one challenge. And there's this other side. How big of a challenge is the investment in this equipment, or even the availability of this equipment? I mean, so far, like I can't go to Home Depot and buy a Kern CNC machine.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
I don't think I can.
You can't.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, millions of dollars of equipment. And then, like sort of this interplay between manual machinery, watchmaker, and the machine. So I'll go back to the balance staff. Balance staff is one of the most important parts in a watch. It's also one of the tiniest parts of the watch. So it takes about an hour to make one balance staff manually by hand. And that's how we were making them. And then from there, this balance staff, which has little staffs on it that are the size of human hairs, has to have those staffs polished. And that polishing process takes tremendous amount of skill. It's usually done in a Jayco tool, which you can Google. That's a tiny little machine that's bow operated. And there's about a 50% chance that one of those staffs could snap off. So an hour for a part, and then it takes some serious hand finishing, and there's a high chance you could wreck that part you just spent an hour on. So recently, after months of R&D, we were able to make these parts on a Citizen L12. Citizen L12 is about $150,000 machine, and we have 2 people that are dedicated just to that machine and just to figuring out how to make these tiny parts. So now we can make a balance staff in a minute, which will then go to a watchmaker that will spend another half an hour on that part. And there are automated processes that could take that balance staff and do it all automated, but I don't have the hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars to automate that one process. So it still has to be done by hand. So anyway, for the point, we had to buy a machine, cost $150,000, 2 dedicated technicians, plus working with an engineer, plus getting constant feedback from watchmakers, all to make a part that will save us an hour per part that could still get destroyed in finishing, but at least we don't have to spend an hour per part on it.
Okay, so one more question before we come out of this dark tunnel. So we have the staffing and educational challenge. We have the prohibitive nature of the investment in the equipment. And then, of course, all those staff need to be present and specially trained to actually do that stuff and utilize those machines effectively so that you're actually outputting enough componentry that you're able to make the watches you need to make. You are making these components for a very, very, very high-end watch by any measure, the Resurgence horology timepiece. Let's say for a moment, let's pretend that you weren't making the Resurgence, but instead what you were trying to do was just a clone of like an SW200, just for argument's sake. Let's assume, like, what would be necessary to do that? Because some of what you're talking about here is also a finish, like the time required for finishing, the time that makes some of these pieces elevated relative to a more, pedestrian movement. Let's say you were making a more pedestrian movement, like, old-fashioned beater of a movement. Is it any more, like, would it be that much easier? Or are we really quibbling around the edges here when we're talking about being able to mass produce something like an SW200 versus the calibers that you're making? Or is it actually more rational and more possible?
It's the same issue. Like, you could throw $20 million at it, but you'd still need a lot of people. There's no getting around that. You need people to operate all the machines you just purchased. You need people, well, you need watchmakers to be able to put these watches together, and for all the sub-assemblies, different aspects of it. A huge labor-intensive part of the watch that takes a tremendous amount of very expensive specialized equipment is everything related to regulating a watch.
So then
Matching
let me ask you,
hairsprings to balances, all of that.
So let me ask you kind of the key rhetorical question. If the work that you're doing and other watchmakers that are ambitious here in the United States are also doing were to be the genesis of a new 21st century American watch industry, do you think that industry looks like what we had 100 years ago with like a mass market, high volume industry? Or is the reality that it's going to be something different? And really what you're working towards is a whole other thing. Like, what should people who say, I want to support the American watch industry picture as the goal in their head?
Yeah, I mean, I think I have to stay in the dark tunnel for one more moment.
I was trying to push you out, man.
Well, I mean, because I think there's an elephant in the room that most consumers don't understand. It's like, why can't the U.S. compete with Switzerland and create a big, large watch industry? And there's one big problem for that. Even if we could find the people, Switzerland has a people problem too. And their solution for that is they go to China. And they're able to leverage China in order to make Swiss-made watches because the Swiss-made label is extremely weak. And if you want to make a made-in-America watch, you cannot do that. And other companies like Shinola have tried to dance around that and then get busted by the FTC. But if you want to say made in America on a watch, it's really got to be made in America. If you want to make a made in Switzerland watch, the majority of it can be made in China, and you can do QC on that in Switzerland, and you've got a made in Switzerland watch. And you can't compete with that in the United States unless we make our label weaker or we ban Swiss watches for having a misleading label on theirs.
Yeah, so let's go through the requirements. I have them here. Like what, and I think we've done this before, but for a watch to be labeled Swiss made, this is what the government in Switzerland requires. The movement must be Swiss, meaning it has been assembled, inspected, and controlled by the manufacturer in Switzerland. So just stopping there for a second, that means that any number of the components of the movement could be from somewhere else. It just has to be assembled and inspected and regulated in Switzerland. So right there, significant cost savings. Components, so the movement and beyond, 50% of the value of all components in the watch must be Swiss made. So you can obviously have parts that are just a few parts that are made in Switzerland, but because, to your point, the labor cost in Switzerland relative to another market, say China, is so much higher, as long as the value is mostly from Switzerland, you could have the minority of the components in the watch made in Switzerland and the majority made elsewhere. Manufacturing costs, similar thing. 60% of production costs have to be generated in Switzerland. Well, you could have a couple of the jobs done in Switzerland to get to that 60% benchmark because of the differences of cost and labor. Technical development. Okay, so the watch and its movement must be developed in Switzerland. There may be some loopholes there. You may hire contractors for engineering or things like that from outside the market. I don't know what the requirements are there, but technical development happens in Switzerland. And final inspection. So just like Swiss cheese, there are all sorts of holes when it comes to what can be Swiss made.
I see what you did there.
We mentioned this at the top of the podcast. Like, made in America, just to be very clear about it, does mean something different. These standards are defined by the Swiss government. This is what they will consider something to be Swiss made and hold up to that claim. But you did some research yourself, Josh, on like what exactly would it take for a watch to be considered made in America? And I think you're the expert in this. I'll let you explain it, but it is worth underscoring the differences here because they are extreme.
Yeah. I mean, the Federal Trade Commission is really good with their broad documentation. You can go onto the Federal Trade Commission and it'll show you many examples of what it means to be made in America. But the barometer is all or virtually all. The gray area is what does that virtually all mean? And it gives many examples of that. There's no specific guidance for the watchmaking industry anymore. I asked for guidance from the Federal Trade Commission for guidance of what the virtually all is referring to. So what I've done personally is I've based what we do off of Hamilton. What was Hamilton doing at their heyday? What were they not doing at their heyday? So for instance, Hamilton at their heyday was importing jewels from Switzerland and sometimes importing balance wheels from Switzerland. Everything else they were making. And so I've sort of taken that as my guidance from them. And so we actually get our jewels made in the United States. We make our own balance wheel, but our hairspring and mainspring we bring in from Switzerland. And then we do a lot of work on the hairspring itself.
Yeah, you had just on the mainspring real quick. I know you had mentioned this to me at one point that like the mainspring is one of the most difficult components of a watch to make, which is hard to believe given some of the difficulties you've explained in other components today. But not only is the mainspring difficult to make, but it's considered, I guess, like a battery for the watch because it's a store of power, which kind of exempts
and it's replaceable. You replace it at services.
Oh, it's like a consumable essentially. So,
correct.
So in that sense, you could still have a made in America watch, but what's considered the battery and a consumable could come from somewhere else. Is that the case? Am I representing that accurately?
Yeah, that's the case. And like it doesn't necessarily sit great with me. My ideal would be to make absolutely everything. But mainspring, hairspring, jewels, crystals, rubber components, these are all like completely separate industries from metal machining and manufacturing, which is what our shop specializes in. So like springs, sapphire, all these things are like left field. So it'd be a completely different investment for me to invest in these things to be able to do them. So it's both a limitation, but I feel very strong that if someone ever reported me to the FTC and the FTC came knocking at my door and said, "Show us what you're doing," I don't worry about that whatsoever. What the FTC doesn't like is when people will say, "Well, all the small components in the watch, pinions, wheels, setting mechanism, all the stuff that we make, it's very easy to harvest those from other watches." It's what many, many, many people do. It's normal. It's fine. But the FTC doesn't like that in terms of American made. Sure, it's not expensive to get those components from Switzerland or China, but that's not all or virtually all of a watch if those components are coming from other places. Doesn't matter, if you're making the bridges and plates, even though those are large components, that doesn't constitute all or virtually all of those, what goes into a watch. And so we make all those components. We make all the difficult steel components, sliding pinion, winding pinion, all these components, pinions. We spend hundreds of dollars, if not thousands of dollars in pinions in our watches, and we could buy them for dollars from Switzerland or China. But those are integral parts that we can't say it's an American-made watch if we're not making them.
Well, couldn't someone say, you mentioned like rubies, that you're able to source them from, I guess, presumably some other company that has the ability to make that stuff in the US. Couldn't someone say like, okay, well, you focus on doing the watchy stuff, your pinions and all that stuff. And then aren't there enough adjacent industries in the United States for things like sapphire and rubies and silicone hairspray. Like, aren't there like, just call up the medical device or the aerospace industry and get them to make you some parts. And maybe you've looked into that. I mean, is that just wishful thinking to assume that all these other industries could just magically backfill these kind of more esoteric parts?
Yeah. So hairsprings, it's like almost. There's just a few companies in the United States that still use hairsprings for certain instruments, and they do it in-house, and they're way larger than watch hairsprings. So that's one specialized industry. That's all in Switzerland. Mainsprings, there are companies in the US that make springs, but they're massive. So once again, that's an industry that's completely specific to Switzerland. Elgin created a special alloy for their mainsprings, and that branch of their company actually survived that makes like specialized alloys of metals. But that company has nothing to do with making mainsprings anymore. And then jewels come from a company called Microlap, and they were formed by Bulova and the Defense Department in the 1950s. Bulova wanted jewels, and the Defense Department wanted a stockpile of jewels in case we ever got cut off from Switzerland again. And so for 20 years, this company made jewels for Bulova and the Defense Department. Bulova went out of business. The Defense Department stockpile filled up. And so they gave this company back to the people in North Dakota. And like you were saying, they made jewels for the medical industry. And so a few years ago, I started hounding them to make watch jewels again. And they kind of laughed at me and said we'd have to bring people out of retirement. And eventually I was able to convince them if I placed a large enough order. But I had to place a large enough order because like no one else is ordering them. You know, like there's no one in this country that's making thousands or tens of thousands of watches that need jewels to support a company focusing on those things. And then you sort of get into chicken and egg problems too. It's like, well, we think there's a big enough market to support a massive US industry. No one knows for sure. And then in order to support that, you need a huge investment and you need a huge number of people. So I know that Vortic is working on being able to make a lot of watch cases. You know, they're bringing in equipment to do that. And I think that's one of the smartest places to start. You know, they're focusing on that. There are automated machines that you can set up to do case finishing. Assembling and waterproofing them is still a lot of work, but that's one area to start. But movements are multiples more complex than watch cases. So it's going to take a lot to bring that back on the mass production scale in the US.
Well, let's go back to Asher's question then, because I think it's a good one, and maybe we're starting to get the answer here, which is maybe it's not like what is your nirvana for what an American watchmaking industry looks like? Because let's just accept, for argument's sake, let's say the definition of made in America or made in the US won't change, and it will remain exactly as you've defined it. So maybe we need to open our minds a little bit and not so much say like the thing we need to focus on is made in America watches, but the thing we need to focus our sights on is a growing and a thriving American watch industry. Do you see it as something that just happens incrementally? Are there certain milestones you'd like to see us reach? So for instance, like, hey, if we could get more case making to start happening in the US, that would be a good, I'm making this up based on what you said. That's a good first step. And maybe the next step isn't actually making movements. Maybe it's doing more dial manufacturing because that's something that maybe is more attainable. So do you see like, maybe there isn't this nirvana, but do you see a couple of key kind of phases or stages you'd like to see the American watch industry sort of tackle one after another and kind of knock off?
So I think my philosophy with it, it's kind of developed and changed over the years, is I'm very much into the slow and steady approach with this. Like I'm trying to build an infrastructure here in my company that's like the ground, like the roots to be able to do something larger. And it's going to take that. And then on top of that, I'm going to eventually have to open up a school that focuses on the skills that are needed, that are unique to watch manufacturing, that are very different than servicing a Rolex. And so that's going to have to grow and expand. And then not insignificant is creating a market for people that even care. And, because everyone says, oh, they'd be excited for American Watch, but the majority of people for the last 70 years have just been buying Swiss for the high end. And to give people a reason beyond patriotism to buy a US made watch is also going to take time. And so we're focusing on extreme quality so that an American consumer feels like he's not losing out buying something from America by not buying something from Switzerland or Japan. And you can see Japan has done that. Japan has Seiko, Grand Seiko, Creedor, and they've really built up their industry in a lot of different ways.
So I want to ask you a question that's obviously very topical right now, which is, you represent a granted niche industry, but you are representing a manufacturing focused business in the United States, manufacturing focused industry in the United States. And at this particular time, in May of 2025, we are seeing the largest regime of protectionist tariffs being applied to American industry that we pretty much haven't seen since the 1930s and before. So I'm curious, as somebody who is manufacturing in the United States and doing so at an industry that is extremely young in its resurgence, what are your thoughts on this? Are these tariffs helping you or hurting you?
So if I existed in a vacuum and the United States government were to only make one tariff, and that was directly aimed at Swiss watches, that would be wonderful for us. All right. That would protect us and force American consumers to say, well, I don't want to have to pay this huge tariff to buy a Swiss watch. Is there anything in the US? Yes, there is. There's one company that's made in America, US watches. I'm going to spend my hard-earned money with them. But it's not in a microcosm. The tariffs are affecting numerous different industries. And so, I make a luxury product. I can't sell product into a recession or depression. But the thought or idea of a tariff for me and the American watch industry would be great in that way, but not in a global way.
As a follow-up question, if assuming that the tariffs in this sense would be there to protect you as you grew and rebuilt an industry, what else would you want to see from a US government to help you grow this industry?
A lot of grant funding. A lot of grant funding for the company and also funding for labor, for education, for people. I think those things have to be all tied together. Forget watchmaking. If you want manufacturing to come back in a bigger way in this country, those things need to be in tandem with it. Though I will say there's a big misconception, and you'll see people on both sides of the aisle saying this, that it's not that American manufacturing went away. It's that we've gotten so incredibly good at manufacturing that we don't need as many people to do it anymore.
One of the things you mentioned was this idea of needing more than just patriotism, right? As a reason to buy a watch, or frankly, anything that's made in America. We talked about this at the beginning of the podcast. There were some real things and some real ways in which the American watch industry and American watches really stood out and were unique and compelling products. So there's the vision of having an industry and building up the talent and the resources and all those things. But what would be the reason beyond patriotism to buy an American watch? What might be some of the things a future American watch industry would hang its hat on? The way the Japanese do with, interesting movements like spring drive, or interesting finishing like Zaratsu.
Yeah.
What do you think an American watch industry might have to offer that is unique?
Yeah, I mean, it's all quality related, right? Like the FTC is really clear about that when you see an American made in America label, you can really trust that thing was actually made in America and everything that goes along with that. When something's made in China, you have no idea what kind of labor practices are going along with that. So that Made in America label means something in terms of where the parts are coming from. But then beyond that, Swiss made has sort of gone hand in hand that this is a precision, high quality timepiece. And since that hasn't existed in the US for a long time, or what has existed has been like hybrid Hong Kong, things like Fossil and Shinola, that what is American quality? We're so far away from Hamilton, Elgin, Waltham in their heyday that there's hardly anyone alive that experienced those watches being manufactured en masse that can say, wow, what a incredible watch that was just made here in this country. Look at the quality of this thing. So that's another thing too. It's got to mean something. That Made in America label has to be a sales point because it represents quality in a lot of different ways. That's why people care about Made in Switzerland. It's supposed to represent a tremendous amount of quality. Otherwise, who would care about the label, right? And despite the fact, Made in China has come leaps and bounds if they're making things that are at such high quality that they're being labeled as Made in Switzerland. So that label is important in sales, but then also fundamentally, it has something to do with trust between you and the consumer. Is this thing really what it says it is? Is it really that quality? Is it really coming from where it is? And so all these things get wrapped up into the Made in label.
So for someone who's like, Josh, I love what you're saying. I love what you're selling. Man, I wish I could buy a Resurgence, but that's just not me, or that's not me right now. What can the average person who's listening do to support American watchmaking and the American watch industry? As we, I think, have clearly learned, this is a journey. It's a long-term journey. It's not going to happen overnight. It's going to happen in fits and starts. But there are things people can do now and do today. So for someone who wants to support American watchmaking, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I'd say go and buy another watch from another American company, because many of the brands in this country have that vision and goal of doing more and more things here in this country. So many other brands are ambitious about wanting to inch along and do more and more, whatever they can within their capabilities and their partners. Like, I'm not the only one in the country that's making cases in America. I'm not the only ones that are making movement components in the country. So there's a lot of companies here that are really trying to grow and do more here. Beyond just Made in America or whatever it is, it's the kind of the goal of any company to make the best product they can. And sometimes that means bringing it in-house yourself so you have the most quality control over it. There's a lot of great watch companies here.
Here. Yeah, even our friend Wesley Kwok, who we had on the podcast to talk about manufacturing in China, notice his brand, they do all their assembly in the United States, right? It's just not possible for them to make their parts here, but it is possible for them to do assembly here. And so they do that. And I think that is a journey we've seen so many watch brands, whether they're partially American made or whatever it might be, that they all seem to be on, which is trying to do as much of it here as they can. So I think that's great advice. And we have to start by starting, as Asher and I like to say. And Josh, we just want to thank you for the part you're playing in this, which is not only quite tangible and meaningful in terms of making watches in America, but it's inspiring. And we're excited to see what you do, but we're also excited to see who you inspire and what comes next. So thank you.
Guys, thank you so much for having me here.
Well, thanks for listening. Open Work is a production of Collective Horology. You can learn more about our guest, Josh Shapiro, at jnshapirowatches.com. And of course, you can find us along with Josh's watches at collectivehorology.com. To get in touch with suggestions, feedback, or questions, email podcast@collectivehorology.com.